Welcome, dear ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. I'm glad you are joining us for the second day of the conference, Digital Transformation of the Agricultural Value Chain, Opportunities, Challenges, and the Role of Science. This conference is organized by the German Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture, as well as the European Agricultural Research Institute, and takes place in the context of the German presidency of the Council of the European Union. My name is Martin Speer. I'm an author and a political consultant, and today I will be your conference guide and moderator. So yesterday, we've gotten quite a few insights, ideas, and observations on the multiple dimensions and challenges of the digital transformation on the agricultural value chain. Today, we will continue this important debate and discussion. In the morning, we invite you to take part in two Track 1 debates discussing the future trends in the field, and Track 2 will happen on invitation only and will offer a private space, a private forum for exchange for policymakers. So this afternoon, just as a quick look ahead, we'll be getting a summary of the Track 2 discussions, followed by a panel discussions, and we will close the conference with remarks by the Federal Ministry as well as EURAGRI. If you would like to share thoughts online, please do so by using the hashtag AgriDigitalEU2020. With that being said, I think we are now ready to start with our Track 1 discussion, and we will discuss future trends of the sustainable digital transformation of the agricultural value chain. And just as a quick announcement, during both sessions today, you as the audience have the opportunity to ask and pose questions. And to do that, you can just enter your question into the chat field or chat section in the right part of your screen. And at the end of the discussion, we will get into a Q&A section, and we will try to address as many of your questions as possible. So feel free to enter your questions already while the speakers are talking, and please indicate to whom you would like to address the question. I would now like to introduce the main moderator of the session. It's Pierre Labarthe, and he's working for the French or at the French National Institute for Agriculture, Food and Environment as a senior economist researcher. Pierre, good morning. It's really great to have you.
Good morning. Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. So I will be very fast for the introduction, as we have four very inspiring talks that will follow. Today we will have mostly viewpoint from research and practitioners from social science and economics point of view to discuss about main issue and business model of the sustainable transformation of agricultural value chain. And I will now give the floor to the first speaker, who is Tom Kelly, who is Director of Knowledge Transfer at iGask Ireland. So Tom, if you could take the floor and share your presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, Pierre. Good morning to everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen with, sorry now. Okay. Now, can you see my presentation, Pierre? Yeah.
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, thank you. So just to say, I am, as Pierre said, I am Tom Kelly from Teagasc. I am the Director of Knowledge Transfer in Teagasc, and what I'm going to do in 10 or 12 minutes is to explain the context of digitalization in, I suppose, an advisory service like Teagasc, and to secondly, look at an international cooperation through the Fair Share project that is addressing some of the issues in this topic. and what we have learned about advisors and farmers and the challenges that they face in this digital world, and then to give you some take-home messages. So just a little bit about Teagasc as an integrated research, advice and education organization. We have a significant impact on farmers in terms of their use of digital technologies, and obviously along with lots of other actors within the Irish ACAS system. This is, I suppose, a challenge to us, but it's equally a big challenge to a lot of small independent advisory services, both in Ireland and Europe and worldwide generally, in terms of the scale and investment needed and the degree to which they're dependent on research support for the development of suitable advisory tools. So when we look at global digitization drivers among advisory services, I suppose they're driven by these 6 items, or have been traditionally driven by these. So firstly, the acceptance of digital tools and services by farmers as part of all services, including ag extension. I suppose the demand from farmers themselves for better, more specific advice and decision support, and the use, maybe much more use of their own individual data in terms of how advisors structure and give advice to them. The demand from advisors themselves for new ways to support and deliver services to farmers, particularly around decision making. And there's a demand from policymakers and society for more information relating to the production and quality of products, the demand for more efficient processes, administration from government and industry, and I suppose finally the advance of low-cost digital technologies, which are ubiquitous and being used in society generally. And so that was fine until March of this year, when we had COVID-19. And this has, I suppose, awoken the sleeping potential among advisors to deliver a lot more services in an online format, because of the restrictions of lockdowns and imposed by COVID on the delivery of traditional service modes such as farm visits and large gatherings of farmers in groups, that it has forced a huge change. And we've seen this in almost every advisory service across Europe. So there's two fundamental questions, or there is a fundamental question here to which there are 2 answers. And the question really is digitization of advisory and extension work a substitute or an aid? I suppose the first answer here would say that it's a substitute, whereas the second answer would say that it's an aid. And from my perspective and the perspective in Teagasc generally at the moment, we are very much in the second answer, in the latter answer, in terms of looking at digital technology in the context of it being an aid to provide better services to farmers through using digital technology tools and services. That's not to say that at some stage in the future there will be parts of advisory activities substitute completely by digital technologies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Fair Share project, and this is based on the FAIR principles, and it's a Horizon 2020 CSA project. It's just finished 2 years of a 5-year project with 23 partners, and it's being led and coordinated by Teagasc. So the aim of this is to try and look at the potential of digital advisory tools to used by advisors to improve the digitalization of farmers. So, and the why? Well, obviously the digital divide is there. We are well recognized among the farmers. It's also there within advisors, and huge variation in their use of digital tools, and also evident in other areas of the supply chain that interact directly with farmers. And again, as I said, what we wanted to achieve was more farmers participating in digital technologies. And the how, and this is where I suppose, we challenged ourselves a good bit in the project in terms of not just sharing or providing digital advisory tools and services between advisors, but also sharing the expertise that supports the development and use of those tools. And finally, to increase the motivation of advisors by having advisors engage with other advisors and farmers who use digital technologies, so that we could stimulate a higher motivation among advisors to use the tools and services that are possible today. So within the project, we did a classification or a characterization of all the tools that were available, and we deliberately cast a very wide net in terms of the tools that are available. So we came up with three broad categories: communication type tools, e-services, which is generally around benchmarking, analytical, etc. tools, and then organizational tools, was very much more looking at the thing from an in-house side of things, like the client billing and quality customer service, etc., and other related internal organizational and management related tools that advisors are using. So with this classification, we set up an inventory, an open inventory, which allows advisors from all over the world and ICT companies, commercial companies who provide services that can be used by advisors to input these into a database. And this is what the database looks like. It's a catalog of very short descriptions of lots of digital advisory tools. And this has been accepting tools since last February. And at the moment, there are, I think, 195 tools in the inventory as of a few days ago. And it's growing all the time. And it's completely open. It's unedited. So in other words, it's users put up the DATs and the digital advisory tools and services that they use themselves. And you will hear this expression, DATS, that's what it means, digital advisory tools and services. So it's not just the tools themselves, but much more focus on the services and how they are used by advisors. So within those tools, in another stage of this project, we have looked at what are the good practices that surround successful tools. And this is part of a key learning process where we hope to provide this learning for other advisory services who are in the process of adapting or changing or thinking about providing new services in a digital format. The third part of the work that we're undertaking is to investigate the everyday problems and characteristics of users, both advisors and farmers, and that interface between advisors and farmers, and to try and understand better where the barriers and where the challenges are in terms of the broader use of digital advisory tools. So we've conducted 2 surveys to date, one survey of advisors and one survey of farmers, and currently we're undergoing focus groups and workshops around this very issue. I'm just going to present you some brief results from the survey, and this graphic, we looked at the type of digital advisory tools and services that advisors use, and this is from the advisors survey with 630 participants. And you can see on the bottom the percentage use of some of the digital advisory tools. And this is a summary really of all the data that's there. So we're looking at the very bottom column, we see that 3 to 4% of the farmers, or sorry, of the advisors didn't use any digital advisory tool or service. So we can see that from that there is a vast majority of advisors who are engaged in some form of digital service provision and use digital tools as part of that service. The second column from the bottom looks at the analysis and benchmarking tools, and we see there about 17–18%, and this is disappointingly low. When we look at the next 3 columns of communications tools, we see again an increased use of those. And remember, this survey was taken out since the COVID restrictions, so we expected this to be even higher, and it probably is a little bit disappointing in terms of in terms of the proportion of advisors using those tools. But when we look at the top bar and we look at the kind of common communication tools like email, phone, and text messaging, SMS messaging, we see that a huge proportion of advisors use those tools in their service, in the offering of their service to farmers. When we look at the degree to which these tools and services are driven by data and where that data comes from, we see the vast majority of data that advisors are using in these services is manually inputted data. And there are other sources of data listed here. And I suppose common other sources of data are things like the National Herd Registers and mapping systems that are available for the various EU-funded schemes, etc. And then technical third-party tools, which will be coming from supply chain actors, etc., and machinery operators, machinery companies, etc. And yeah. So when we look then at the client base of each individual advisor, and we asked the participants to categorize their clients into their percentage use of digital tools among that client base, and we got back this reaction. So it's disappointing that the two green slices of the pie chart here shows that for less than 20% and 20% to less than 50% of the client base are not availing of digital advisory tools and services. We see that there is a considerable amount of work still to be done to get more farmers engaged with their advisors through digital technologies, or reversing that the other way around, more advisors engaged with their clients through digital technologies. And I suppose one of the key findings from the study, both from the farmers and the advisors survey, was that advisors want to provide a personalized service. So in other words, that providing broad information to farmers isn't really in the nature of advisors. They want to personalize, and whether that's data coming from an individual farm, or whether it's data coming from but presented to a farmer and on an individual basis, it does, I suppose, fit the need of the advisor much more in the context of advisors. I suppose this is understandable in the context of advisors having in many cases to generate income from their services. So just to conclude, there are, I suppose, on that last point, there's a preference from farmers and advisors for digital tools that support a more personalized advisory service. Both farmers and advisors have similar expectations in terms of the benefits that they get from digital technologies. Both groups, again, advisors and farmers, are challenged by the investment needed, time, cost, financial cost that is, and learning effort. And these should not be underestimated. They came up quite strong in the survey. Advisors lack a reliable reference source for the digital advisory service, and this was seen in that many advisors relied on other advisors and word of mouth for their sourcing of tools and services appropriate for their tools and services appropriate for their client base. And farmers are influenced to use digital advisory tools and services by advisors and by other farmers. Advisors recognize that they need training, but I suppose they do prefer that training to be provided in person rather than online. And interoperability was an issue among both groups, both advisors and farmers surveyed in this particular study. So, Chairman Pierre, this is what I have, and thank you very much for your attention. I hope that was clear and you could hear it.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was a very interesting topic. I don't know if there were some questions raised during your presentation. I didn't see comment put in the chat. I had what was very interesting to my opinion that we can take for the Q&A session at the end is this issue of personalization of advice, and that's even though digital technology are often presented as very generic technology, you clearly indicate that the expectation of both advisors and farmers are to use this technology to go even one step further in the personalization of advice, and I find it very interesting. Could you maybe give an example or some one more extra point on this issue, and then we will come back to this maybe in the global discussion?
Yeah, I think that the personalization manifests itself in, for example, where farmers provide data from individual crop data or individual data, from animal data, for example, from fertility in the dairy herd, taking an example. Advisors would traditionally have tried to benchmark that data against other maybe research type data, and by providing advisors either individually or looking at their own cohorts of similar farmers, that it's very much more personalized in terms of where they're benchmarking against. And equally, even data relating to soil quality or soil fertility or this, it's very much around having specific advice related to that farm, that context, rather than the more generic, broad textbook advice that is given through more general use. So there are lots of examples, and it came out quite strong in the study that this, now the degree to which that's influenced by habit, Pierre, your study within the AgriLink project might even understand this better. Sorry, Pierre, are you muted?
Yes, I was muted, sorry. Thank you very much for your presentation, Tom. We will have to go to the next presentation to try to keep on time. So the next presentation will be provided by Professor Cynthia Gianniocavo from the Faculty of Economics and Management of the University of Almería. So, Cynthia, could you start sharing your presentation?
Yes, good morning.
Thank you.
There we are. Everything fine?
Yes, perfect.
All right. I'm going to be talking, doing sort of a whirlwind tour today from the farm to the philosophical or theoretical. But what I'm interested in here is looking at how we transform the organization of value and also the business models in this process of digitalization. Just a very quick introduction. I hold the chair of COEXPAL, University of Almería, and Agriculture Cooperative Studies in Sustainable Development. And this chair acts as a bridge between our university, our sector, or the university world, and also the agricultural sector. And it's actually promoted and funded by the sector. And this sector has about 80 cooperatives and 15,000 farmers. So it was really important for us to try to add value and help in this transformation, all the transformations that they have to go through, not just digitalization. The University of Almería, you might not have heard of it, but it's in that tiny little corner of Southeast Spain. We're a full-service university. We have a specialization in agriculture, and we're particularly focused on intensive agriculture and all the related technologies. We're involved in quite a few projects. We're involved in Smart Agri Hubs. We're involved in Internet of Food and Farm, Fair Share, Nefertiti, and CoFresh. And the point here is that these projects are basically leveraged to help our sector. And we come at it from all different angles. So the Internet of Food and Farm was very much about digitalization on the farm level. Smart Agri Hubs is more on the ecosystem level. Nefertiti is very much based on how do we transfer knowledge, how do we demonstrate that digital technologies work or don't work. Fair Share, we're involved a little bit. I'm involved in the business models there, and farm advisors play a key role too. And a new one is CoFresh, which is looking at sustainable value chains in Europe. This is a little scheme from Smart Agri Hubs, and I just thought it was a nice snapshot to show all the different aspects we're looking at in this conference. which is basically the public decision making and all the areas that that touches on. There's a lot of technologies there, so I won't be going through all of them, but you've heard about them throughout the day. And also the fact that we're looking at business decision making, we're looking at food integrity, science and technology, and in the midst of that is that whole value chain. So this is an extremely complex task that we're dealing with in this conference. So let me parachute you into my world, both past and present. This is just an example of the many, many different agricultural systems that exist around Europe. In Southeast Spain, we started out the very top corner going clockwise. We started out with a really, really poor, impoverished area, and there was the discovery of water and electricity, and then they had to figure out how to grow food in that area. So they used these really rudimentary greenhouses, and they had to create sort of their own soil because the soil was so poor. And then they set up cooperatives, and then they had to introduce, so they could create economies of scale. And then they had to introduce more sustainable practices because there was too many pesticides and too much pollution, et cetera, et cetera. So we've gone through many transformations, the integrated pest management, looking at technologies in greenhouses, et cetera. So this is not new, this idea of innovation and digitalization. It's just another wave, and how do we do it? This is a snapshot of the greenhouses of Almeria, but I thought it's a nice metaphor for what we're dealing with here, which is basically atomization. We have to think of all the data that is actually produced in each of those farms. And it's really quite extraordinary. How do you create networks of knowledge? How do you create economies of scale, not only in production, but also in the information that comes from data so that it can be used again? We've heard talk of data cooperatives, for example, which I personally think is a wonderful idea, but not so easy to get off the ground. We've started a little digital innovation hub to help the process. In IOF, we've taken this atomized picture you just saw and tried to turn it into a value chain that was aided by digitalization through digital support or decision support systems, working at the greenhouse level, the cooperative level, and the transport level. That leaves out a lot of things in the value chain, but that was a start. Now, I'm not going to go into detail here. You can look at this in your own time if you are so interested. But it was just to give you an idea of, it's a very complex part. It's not just a digital tool. It's the whole process, and it's the implementation of digitalization in the whole value chain. We're talking about the organization of value creation, and we're talking about business models, okay? So often we talk about supply chains, but then we found that that was only about the internal part of the firm, how do we move things along the chain? Then the literature start talking about net chains, value chains. My question is, well, are we really talking about chains? But let's take a little look at this. So we have the food production chain, that's very linear. And then coming from the business side, the organizational studies side, there's this person called Michael Porter. Some of you might know him, some not. And that was really quite a change, because it was about talking about the value chain analysis, looking at not only primary activities, but also looking at support activities. And there was a recognition that value had to be created not only within the business, but also for society in general. And we can see that in one of those support activities up in the right-hand corner is technological development, and also things like infrastructure. And, yesterday there was, those terms were mentioned quite a bit about, we need infrastructure, we need broadband, we need more investment, that kind of thing. We also heard about skills, so the human resources management, et cetera. So that's an important diagram there. That made a big change in management studies. And then we had this idea of the net chain, which is in the bottom corner, the little different things. And that was always also saying, well, it's not just about that sort of linear progression, it's also about all the relationships, both commercial, social, economic, environmental, that happen at all the different stages. So we've got more of a complex net chain. Then we move to this conceptual idea of, well, we should get away from this idea that we're just taking inputs and producing things along the way and creating outputs that are undesirable. And we come to the idea of the circular, right? And then finally, we come to this idea of the food system, and you'll see that in the lower left-hand side. So we're looking at what are all this, where's the value created all along the way, and not just in the production system, but also in the so-called outputs. Okay. Value, that's the big question. What is value? People talk about value. It's creation, the capture. Yeah, you have to comprehend what's valuable, create it, and capture it. And that's tied to the growth strategies. I would argue that we shouldn't only focus on growth. I think other people throughout yesterday also would be in agreement with that. There are various ways to talk about value. The little green triangle is a very popular one in business studies as well, looking at what we offer for customers, what revenue, what value proposition. And then the circles are more, looking at the sustainable business models, right? So we have different ways of thinking about value. But I want to say that I think we should focus on value chains and networks and their role in competing. And I don't mean that in sort of the most narrow form, but the basic thing is that in order to be sustainable in all senses of the word, it's not just about the individual business, right? So for example, in Smart Agri-Hubs, what we've tried to do is look at the potential applications of digital technologies, in agriculture, and the importance of the integration of that data in the whole value chain. So if you enter into the portal, for example, you'll see this tool, much like in Fair Share, you can put in your solutions. We've also got one too that is for competence centers. So this is sort of cutting edge technologies, and it's about, okay, well, how can we locate those technologies in the supply chain, in the value chain, so that it's embedded all the way there. But these projects are wonderful, but they don't, in my mind, still, clearly they can't go far enough. Because what we need to understand is that these value chains and networks, et cetera, compete amongst themselves. As I said, it's not just the individual firms. The competition is not just between products, services, and digital technologies. It depends on the strength of the ecosystem. And that's why that's so important. And, the ecosystem has an impact on the business models and can also, in a way, be considered sort of a model in and of itself. In IOF, in Internet of Food and Farm, there were some business models identified there. And you've probably seen those in other studies. And, people talk about the different keys to those business models and the innovation, and that there's asset sharing and all of these other things, agility, et cetera. But I'd like to point out that what's really important is also other kinds of business models like platforms, collaborative initiatives, commons, cooperatives, social enterprises, et cetera. 27, I'm just looking at how I'm doing for time. I can't see the chat, so if I'm going a little bit over.
Yes, Cynthia, if you could, 2 minutes left, please.
2 minutes left. Okay, then we have to move along here. Okay, so what I want to say by showing this is that how we govern the exchange of value matters. And this is just an example, Eleanor Ostrom's rules for common pool resources. Should we start looking at agricultural data, digital solutions, infrastructure as a common pool resource? Okay, and this gets us into the idea of organizational value logics, that the business model's been conceived as a commercial logic of value proposition, creation, exchange, and delivery. But what we have to talk about is what value is offered and to whom, and how do we value? What is valued, how, and by and for whom? So the business model is embedded in organizations and systems, right? And they're influenced by a variety of institutional logics. So this is a broad sort of canvas of institutional logics. And you can see I've got circled the market, corporations, et cetera. There's a logic of democracy, the logic of capitalism, yeah? But where is the logic of the state, but where's the logic of cooperative social enterprise, the environmental logic, the logic of community, right? Because business models are all embedded in that. So, for example, if we go to this scheme that the FAO has on transformation, because that's what we're really talking about here, from the incremental to that which is truly transformative, I'd like to know where people think, where are we in the digitalization of agriculture? Are we still in the incremental? I think we can go to the transformational, but a lot needs to happen along the way. So I'm almost done here. I've noticed certain things in reviewing literature recently and looking at various discussions of policy, and that we are seeing more and more references to conflict in the notion of shared or unshared value, and how we have to use the conflict, these different institutional logics, as uses conflict as a positive driver for transformational change. That we had a reference to discourse analysis. We see that it's about trying to understand how we can transform this, different ways, competing logics, so that we have a more sustainable mode of operation, right? So just this is my last slide. What is the future? Because that's the theme of our segment here. And, you know, digitalization is not new. I mean, we've seen this in the finance sector a very, very long time ago. And my observation here is that digitalization has profoundly changed the financial markets such that most trades are done by algorithms. High-speed trading makes markets. And yet we still have these institutional old-fashioned logics that somehow, you know, it's all about freedom of contract and free markets and all these things, right? As if digitalization never occurred. And I think we have to be very careful of that in agriculture. So 3 points here. Contested institutional logics. We have to resolve those, but we have to do so that social, environmental, economic innovations result and not destructive conflict resolution. Business models and institutional logics, we need to find ones that most equitably deal with the digital transformation and not bend this transformation into dominant institutional logics. And that policy should not put a burden and the risk of resolving these incompatible logics on just the farmers. So, for example, environment versus market, or other stakeholders who provide green goods, like environment versus growth. And there was other comments yesterday about that. Like, look, if you want farmers to do this, then you have to help them do it because they can't do it on their own dime, so to speak. So if we think about the fact that 1% of farms control over 70% of the world's total farmland, that small farms account for 84% of all farms, operate only 12% of agricultural land, and yet produce 36% of the world's food. Our question then is, really, in the future, what are we going to do for those smaller farmers? Or is digitalization going to drastically change farming in Europe so that it's basically a future we might not want to have, and that will have sort of serious environmental impact? So those are sort of open questions, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cynthia, for this inspiring presentation. We are a bit beyond schedule, so I think we will switch directly to the next presentation to keep time for the overall discussion. But I really take for the discussion this question of equity and of the idea of a data cooperative. And that this idea should be raised on a shared vision of values, which could be debated later on in the question and answer. So thank you very much for your presentation. And I will now give the floor to Chris Addison, who's consultant, and I'll let you introduce yourself and your presentation. And please try to keep us on track with time. Thank you, Chris. We cannot hear you, Chris. Put on your mic, please. No, still not.
Can you hear me now?
It's perfect. Thank you.
Good. I'm Chris Addison from Communique. I'm going to speak a little on enhancing trust in the food system with blockchain technology. I think I give a few jumping off spots, so I'll be quite quick in the presentation, and there are further links in the presentation for background. Building on what Cynthia was saying, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the strengths and vulnerabilities of the
Sorry, Chris, could you share your presentation?
blockchain situation. Can you no longer see it?
I can't, at least.
Okay, I'm sharing it, and it's not displaying for some reason.
Oh, and now, yeah, now it starts, Chris. I think it's, yeah, we can see it. Now it works
Okay.
perfectly.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you very much.
Right, sorry about that. So I want to talk about some of the trust issues and the strengths and weaknesses of blockchain. As I think we've seen across a whole range of those issues affecting agriculture, blockchain has been coming in as a way of proving the data, at least recording it in an immutable way in the database. And I've been looking at some global implementations, particularly outside Europe. So these are some of the examples we found in the different areas. Wanted to really focus on the strengths and vulnerabilities. So whilst blockchain gives us a trust system in terms of the immutability of data, not being able to change those records as recorded in a ledger, and it also gives us transparency, a decentralized system with the opportunities for equity, the idea of a virtual organization rather than a centralized entity in real terms, smart contracts where payments can be made automatically on the basis of certain criteria, ID control, information on the consumer, the certification of products and building consumer confidence. There are many weaknesses there. It's still an established entry cost for individual organizations. There is this move now from transparency to more private networks, so the use of distributed ledger technology, not necessarily adopting all of the principles initially of blockchain. And this decentralization does make it complex, making it more difficult to raise awareness and access to the skills. And with a virtual organization, the issues of support are difficult. The issues of policy and governance also change. Smart contracts are all very well, but if you don't know how they're issued, they're limited value. So the openness of algorithms is important. The ownership of the system has drifted. So whilst the original premise was this could be collective ownership, in reality, many of the implementations become owned by larger corporations, organizations. And there's just the general issues around communication, standards and interoperability, and some of the concerns over the long-term security of the system and the changes that happen. So looking at the kind of trust element, who's the consumer from blockchain? Okay, we can build confidence in the customer at the supermarket, the agricultural product consumer, but there's also a role here for improving the situation of the farmer in trusting the data around them, in government in accessing the data and making value judgments in policy, and for agribusiness to improve the whole transparency and consolidation of the value chain. The consumers has concerns at different levels, so from food safety through to the environment, through to climate change, impacts of the food production service, the equity, does the farmer get a reasonable payment for the goods? And in terms of labor, is there child labor involved or slave labor involved in production of the product? So we've got this crisis of confidence, which has been kind of dealt with the certification of products. But how to prove that's really the case? This can really be dramatically important. Consumer trust fell by 24% in the UK during what was known as the horse lasagna scandal back in 2013, with 6 out of 10 consumers changing their shopping habits. So this has a huge impact. And 8.4% in 1 month of sales increased in organic through the Soil Association, where customers were choosing to buy organic as a sign of integrity and quality. So people are looking for this reinforcement of truth in their products. How can blockchain really help with that? the fact that blockchain's been linked as a time-stamping process, so at any handshaking moment in the value chain, when the farmer hands over the original goods, when they're paid, when they're packaged, when they're shipped, you can timestamp that process. You can see how the food has been dealt with. If you add sensors, so looking at how foodstuff is kept in the cold chain from production to point of sale. Product tracking generally in terms of packaging. I think we've all seen this in terms of QR code use, and increasingly blockchains being used to reinforce ID management. This integration with automated systems and those kind of algorithms which may be used, for example, for paying out insurance on agricultural situations with climate threats. The algorithms are there to issue that smart contract, and the consumer has a way of back checking all of this by looking through an application and Explorer to see these various steps in the chain. So whilst blockchain can provide all of these things, the reality is the consumer doesn't necessarily see it that way. So this is from a recent paper by Holicek, where blockchain doesn't really solve all the trust issues when it comes to the real world. Human beings are still looking for the brands. It's not the case that there really is this trust fee situation yet. The role of the platforms as a broker and curator. So as I said, trusting a brand, trusting that supermarket, trusting the intermediary is really not there. It hasn't changed in the consumer's mind. And thirdly, they may have got a different idea about what blockchain really is. The press may have pushed things like Bitcoin. There may be suspicion over the kind of stories that have put that in a very different domain, not necessarily in the trust domain. But that seems to be changing with time. From the farmer's point of view, as a consumer, imagine where we've got to, the stage where a farmer effectively from a digital watch can start in the near future to really be able to validate all those steps in the chain. So you can, the farmer has the ID, they have their organic certification, their training, they have transactions of payments. In many cases, there are opportunities to look at what's happening as well through the blockchain ledger at the shop, the transfer, the packaging, and linking in the consumer as well. Now, the technology allows access to all that. How much of it will be available in the future? Groups I've been working with across Africa have been looking at that in relation to coffee and chocolate chains to be able to see how that information is available. And they're already starting with giving farmers access to that on a smartphone. But giving that blockchain guarantee on the fact that the entries haven't been changed gives that overview of the value chain. And by the same token, external information the farmer might want on weather, on remote sensing, on the state of crop, on state of pests, access to markets, government regulations, and their registration with the government. Also, those systems are being built up. So do we have the situation, as I say, in a nearer future, that the farmer has access to all this information and it's being validated by blockchain? But blockchain sits behind the scenes in the same way that when we visit a website, HTTP is the old protocol. We're all used to seeing that on the website. The HTTPS gave us that guarantee of a website adhering to the latest protocol, a way of improving trust in that site. So I mentioned these elements in the trace on the blockchain, the fact that all of the individual elements could be entered, and then this is available through the Explorer. But how does that actually happen? So there are two ways that this may happen. A transaction may be requested by an individual. So there's a human face-to-face handshake moment when the farmer is requesting the payments for goods and wants to put that on the blockchain. That transaction sent to the peer-to-peer network, which validates each node, the request, puts it into a block and adds that to a ledger, which cannot be changed. That is then the transaction that's complete and permanent. In the second case, this may be a more automated process. So a combination of events tracked in data from remote sensing, from satellites, and from weather stations and weather forecasting might lead to an insurance payment on insurance for weather conditions. And that individual transaction might follow the same route. So both a personal intervention involving a person, but also more increasingly these automated interventions being recorded on the blockchain. Blockchain obviously secured with the crypto solution, so looking at encrypting data is a key component. The idea of having two keys to access that data, one private, one public, is a key element to the chain. And then the fact we've got that timestamp and a way to review all of the transactions that happen through that transaction give the information on the chain. The insurance payments that I was talking about happen not through individuals entering that data, but through an automatic feed. And these feeds are known as oracles. So there you would take several sources to say what the weather was actually doing, and you'd add to that the timestamp and the rest, code it up through decentralized computation, then do the blockchaining element, and then make payments automatically through enterprise systems, through traditional payments, as well as through cryptocurrencies. But making those oracles secure, those sources of data, means you've got to take special steps, looking at the distributed source. I mentioned multiple sources, determining what is really the truth, using open software for part of it to gain the confidence in the algorithms, but also using closed systems to ensure the cryptography and the hardware that the data source isn't tampered with, tracking the performance of individual sources so you can actually see how well they're performing, and being able to certify those sources and have service agreements to reward performance and give penalties for bad performance. From the government point of view, there's a whole series of pluses and minuses around blockchain. It does give more confidence in being able to deal with some of the key problems in agricultural inputs, particularly in the LMIC, the low middle income countries that I work with. So avoiding fraud at the input level by being able to validate products, providing the market information in a form that is immutable, working out issues like e-payments, e-finance, and putting more confidence into that through blockchain activities, and just some of the basics of validating the data in organization. But it gives a big headache in terms of the policies that the government needs to put in place to enable or control these technologies. And Deloitte recently put out a risk management paper, I give them the reference here, where they're just talking about the risks to agribusiness of introducing this technology, the strategic risks, the business continuity, contractual issues in particular, and many of these worries with the smart contracts are around the regulatory environment and the enforcement of contracts. And then this whole idea of transferring the value that was mentioned before. These consensus protocols need to be clear, the data confidentiality, and as we've heard a lot, I think, in the Bitcoin world, it's so important to manage those private keys for access to the value. So I wanted to be quick so that we could catch up on time, and just encourage you to look at some of those background links for further details on the information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris, for this very interesting discussion. I will propose that we go directly to the next presentation and keep questions for the overall discussion. I guess that the trust issue in this kind of decentralized system will come back for the discussion. And I will give the floor to Professor Gianluca Brunori from the University of Pisa. So Gianluca, if you could share your screen and start your presentation, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. Can I ask to the organizers to launch? Yes, sorry, I had a technical problem, so I put my picture there in case my presentation didn't work. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, the title of my presentation is A Safe and Just Operating Space for the Bioeconomy, the Role of the Digitalization, the fifth SCAR Foresight Report. Actually, this is the presentation of the outcomes of a foresight exercise a group of experts carried out, commissioned by the SCA, the Standing Committee for Agricultural Research, in relation to the challenges of the Europe for the next years. And actually, the concept of safe and just space for humanity is based on the idea that development and then policies and economy should be, let's say, based on two tracks. The first track, the environmental ceiling, is a set of biophysical indicators that should not be trespassed if we don't want that our ecosystem get damaged. And but on the social foundation, you need also to respect social standards in order to avoid that the social systems are put at risk. Next slide, please. Yes, and for this reason, we adopted a backcasting methodology in which we identified the goal. We set a number of targets, 11 targets that specify this bigger goal for Europe, and then we analyzed the way, coming from the present situation, what kind of barriers, but also drivers and trade-offs could be, let's say, could be considered in terms of the transition to these goals. And starting from this present assessment, we identified the research needs necessary to achieve this goal. Next slide, please. Okay, digitalization then is considered a key driver of this transition because, as you know, digitalization is not just technological progress. It is the incorporation of digital technologies into practices and organizational patterns of civil society, private business, and public administration. So these technologies embodied in form of infrastructures, application systems, and services, the way they are incorporated into these practices and into governance patterns provide an impact. Next slide, please. But as you know, this impact and the debate of today and also of yesterday has put into light that this impact can be both positive and negative, and depending on the way digitalization occurs. And so for this reason, it is important that there is a mechanism that drives the digitalization towards the positive goal, to maximize them and to avoid unintended consequences. For this reason, the SCA recommends a responsible research and innovation approach that aims at shaping research objectives and planned activities in relation to expected impact. Next slide, please. So the pathways we have identified in this foresight process are three. The first one is related to nutrition. So we aim at giving nutrition, healthy and sustainable food for all. And what does this imply? For all is a clear, specific and also numeric targets, 100% people having sustainable diets. The second one is related to the full circularity of food systems. And the third one is to restore the diversity of our food, farm, and social systems. Next slide, please. So how digitalization can affect the three pathways? We have seen that in the area of nutrition and food in general, one important component is behavioral change. Already yesterday, we have seen that there is a potential for nudging of these technologies and also some risk related to nudging. But in the examples we have made, we have seen that, for example, there are games for children to educate to have a better nutrition. There are applications that give consumers the footprint of the food they buy, or to let's say to business, they help them to calculate in an easier way the footprint of their processes. There are more complex digital systems based on wearables and with biometric data that can provide personalized information, but also the use of digital cards and the database that can be built around it can provide individual assistance to people in need. Next slide, please. Okay, when we go to circularity, we really consider important the issue of matching between demand and supply of bioresources. So if a company wants to produce bioproducts coming from residues of other processes and then introduce in circularity, they need to have this information. So we need not only databases that help to understand and to retrieve this information, but also the possibility of collaboration between firms. And there are apps on for data on soil, diagnostic disease online automatically through artificial intelligence, or also waste management through sensors that can sort the different types of residues and then provide the opportunities for their reuse. Next slide, please. And with diversity, we know that economic and biological diversity come together. And so we know, for example, that in the field of agri-biodiversity, the key to diversity is exchange between users. And then social network-like tools can help farmers, and actually they do, help farmers to exchange their seeds. But also, for example, it is possible to consider the disintermediation between producers and consumers through apps that also use the georeferencing and the possibility of order at the distance. But also at a broader level, using big data, it is possible now to monitor the fishing activities at the global level. Next slide, please. But as I told at the beginning, digitalization has its potentials, but also it has several risks. And this risk should be taken into consideration when activating innovation and research activities. So we should ask, and the researchers should ask in advance, if the digital solution limit the freedom of some actors, if it reduces the privacy, it creates stigma on some actors, or if the solution moves inadvertently towards unwanted situation. So as you know, reality is not fully pink or fully black, and it is really important that these questions become the questions of researchers. And with this, next slide, please, I would like to thank you.
Many thanks, Gianluca, for your presentation. That was perfectly on time. I think that you can now maybe stop sharing the screen and that all speaker, Cynthia, Tom, Chris, and Gianluca, you can put your maybe camera on so that we could have a lively discussion. I know there have been many questions on the chat, but on the Q&A session. But maybe to start a discussion, I would have myself a generic question for the four of you. Many very inspiring dimensions in your talk about the personalization of solution in Tom's presentation, about value and institution in Cynthia's one, about trust in Chris' presentation, and about the issue of risk in Gianluca's presentation. But my main question would be about the role of science. It is one of the focus of this conference, and more specifically about the role of social sciences. We were speaking about this transformation, and how would you picture the role of social science? Is it to articulate demand? Is it to identify risk? Is it to understand institution in this transformation dynamic? So I wanted to give the floor to the four of you to maybe elaborate what you see as main challenges for social science in a digital transformation of supply chains. So I don't know who would like to start.
Yeah.
Yes, Gianluca?
Yes, actually, thank you for this question, because it is something that I'm living as an agronomist who have a social science background. And actually, I think that social sciences in this regard helps developers, for example, to understand the system in which technological devices are incorporated. So you cannot just produce technologies without understanding the social context in which it happened, in which it's incorporated, and to try to understand what are developments that the technology may generate. So when we consider, for example, the concept of game changers, the social scientists can help to understand what is the game that is played, because in order to understand what is a game changer, you have to understand the game, and a technology is not a game changer per se. And then you have to consider that also, if you change the game for worse, it will be not a very successful activity. So I think that this dialogue, which is very important, but it's not easy, because you have to consider different languages, different frames, different mentalities. So it needs a long and intense interaction between these fields.
Thank you, Gianluca. Cynthia first, and maybe Chris after.
Yeah, I mean, what is the role of science? Well, I think technology is the child of all the innovation in social sciences, right? I mean, and then it depends on how you want to bring that child up, on how it behaves, right? But this sort of goes to my presentation, which was the role of social sciences is to understand this process of the creation of value. I mean, what we perceive as value has a lot to do with social sciences. The study of where is value created, why do we consider it valuable, and who is producing this value and for whom? Who's benefiting this? I mean, if people have talked a lot about ownership the last day, and I come more from a cooperative perspective, and we don't talk about ownership so much in cooperatives. We talk about control, use, and benefits. So who gets to use it, and who has control of it, and where are the benefits? And I think I think Gianluca was, rightly so, saying, we have to pay attention to the risks here. It's not all roses. This is not a neutral. There's no such thing as technologies are neutral, but their impact is not neutral. So I think that's the role of social sciences, is to say, what is this child going to do when it goes through life? What is the value, and to whom? And that includes the environmental aspect as well, of course.
Thank you. Maybe another comment by Chris.
Yeah, just briefly, I think there's a role in the actual implementation process of digitalization. I work with a number of donors who are supporting the intervention to balance equity and social development goal norms. And there we operate with kind of 9 principles, which are known as the digital principles, which you can see at digitalprinciples.org. And I think those are real areas where they need reinforcement from the research community. There are issues like understanding the existing ecosystem, what's happening in the community, so that the product's designed with the user in mind, building for sustainability, how open standards and sharings are used, and how the privacy and security and those elements, and I kind of echo that it is more important to talk about how the data is to be used rather than ownership, also for legal reasons. But there are 9 principles there at digitalprinciples.org that I encourage you to have a look at, that we certainly use in the SDG community for introducing digitalization. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know if Tom has a comment, because I cannot see Tom, and my computer indicated he may have some network issue.
No, I can. I'm here, but
thanks. Perfect. Do you have a comment?
I've shared my video, but yeah, yeah. In terms of the social science, I think is a really important question, and I think we certainly within the Fair Share project and even within an organisation like Teagasc acknowledged the need for peer-to-peer influence and learning in terms of how we get, I suppose, to the bottom. We call it the bottom third of our client base, or the bottom third of our staff, even in terms of getting them more interactive and more involved in digital technologies. So I think it's really important that we approach this, and certainly we have, I suppose, struggled in the past with these 9 principles, as was mentioned by Chris. I think it's really important, and certainly within the Fair Share project, in terms of looking at good practices around the digital tools that our advisors are using, we see a very strong impression coming from those principles in terms of those successful tools that are used. And the other thing coming from the social science area is the whole, I suppose, cultural movement that's there in society generally. I think it shouldn't be ignored that every farmer lives in a family circumstance that is influenced by lots of other things going on, and that has a huge impact in terms of their openness, acceptance, and trust of the technology, and maybe mistrust as well when it comes to that.
Thank you, Tom. I will have thousands of questions myself, but I think I will give the floor to Martin, that may raise a question that we put on the question and answer section of the streaming, because I have many questions. So Martin, please.
Thank you very much, Pierre. And it was really great following that very interesting discussion. So we do have a lot of questions, and I see 2 main trends, or two areas where we got more questions than in other fields. So the whole issue of values created or gained some interest, as well as the whole topic of blockchain. So maybe we start with the whole discussion around values, and maybe that first question goes to you, Cynthia. One member of, or one perspective from the audience, or one question from the audience states, which kind of value may the public administrations deliver to the farmer industry, and how can that work?
The first question is what kind of value, in the sense, as opposed to values, I assume, right? So what kind of value can the public administration deliver? Well, I think that the public administration has a very large role. If we, for example, if we go back to even a very simple diagram of the value chain, which is Porter, I mean, that's nothing even revolutionary. Clearly, the public administration has a huge role in providing the conditions under which technology can be developed, distributed, knowledge circle, the infrastructure. I mean, Yesterday, someone kept saying broadband, broadband, broadband. We need that. I mean, even something as simple, a concept as simple as that, which is access. So, I mean, public administrations are key. This is not something that one can just do it through individual sort of, force and ingenuity. So yeah, I mean, but what's key here clearly is that the public administrations have to have a very close engagement with their communities. And it's not just farmers, it's advisors, it's auxiliary industries, and it's also the general public, the citizens, because they're often very much a driver for the environmental concerns. So that broad range of stakeholders and the public administration is in the position where they actually can make that consultation with such a broad range of stakeholders and then actually push policy to do something about it. So fundamental in helping deliver value from digitalization.
Thank you very much. Maybe as a next question, because it directly relates or pretty much relates to that. So if we do not know the value, then why are we going top down with this digitalization schemes and big projects like IOF? So why not a bottom up approach? And maybe that's also to you, Cynthia, but if others
really
want to dive in or add to it, please feel free.
Okay.
And then we...
I didn't mean to suggest a top down, not at all. But I mean, I think we have to work from several different directions at the same time. I'm a big believer in push from the bottom up. The citizen engagement is crucial. The farmer engagement is crucial. And innovation often is a combination of top down, sideways, and bottom up. I actually, being part of IOF, because we have a use case, yes, it's a huge monster of a project, right? And it covers all of Europe, et cetera. But when you look at what actually happens at the use case level, it's engagement with our local community. I mean, we're tramping through, the farms of people of 2 hectares, and we're dealing on a constant basis with the problems that farmers have, whether it's getting suitable sensors or having access to data, et cetera. So I would actually say that even though it's a large scale project, and this goes with Smart Agri Hubs as well, there's a lot of engagement on the ground, and you may not see it on the website as much, and it's not, glamorous or anything else. It's usually in the local language, so it doesn't get disseminated across Europe, but locally it does. So yeah, didn't mean to suggest at all it should be top down, but we can't ignore that when we're dealing with infrastructure and something that is a societal good, that we need the institutions of society.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Does anyone want to add to this?
Yes, if I may,
Yes,
because with the ZIRA project, you may know that I am a coordinator of a Horizon 2020 project on socioeconomic impact of digitalization. Actually, we are starting from the needs of the local communities, looking also at the communities that apparently don't have any digitalization process. Actually, this is in the end not true, because everyone now have a smartphone or have some access to internet. But in any case, it is very important in our case to really understand what is the system to which these technologies may be applied. And also in terms of the mix of technologies, it may make a very difference to better understand the needs of local communities. But also, as Cynthia says, that I wouldn't say that digitalization should only go bottom up, because in some cases, for example, if you consider sustainability, in some cases we have already a frame, a global frame, and some targets. And in these targets sometimes get at clash with local practices, and this is what transition means. You need to shift from a present state to a different state. And in order to shift to this different state, you need a mix of bottom-up and top-down approaches. And to address the first question related to public administration, I think that especially in rural areas, public administration can provide a huge number of services that at this moment rural areas have not. And in this case, there is needed, especially in rural areas, a real digital revolution of the internal organization of public administrations, because most of them still work on papers.
Thank you very much. Pierre, always feel free to add, or if you want to dive deeper into one of the topics.
No, just a quick comment. I also think that the notion of risk that was addressed by Gianluca, but also by Cynthia in our presentation, and maybe a bit by Chris also. It also relates to the role of public administration, and I think that there is a role where the notion of who controls the digitalization process should be also negotiated, and there is a role for public actors to be part of this type of negotiation. So bottom up is important, but as Gianluca said, it's a matter of also of combination, and even there is some very interesting role from Mazzucato, for instance, that even for the generation of this digital innovation, the state and the support, both financially and through university and creating knowledge hubs and networks, played a major role. But maybe I will stop talking because I think we have other questions still on the Q&A.
Another field that was or is moving people a lot is the whole issue and discussion around blockchain. And maybe we kick off with the following question, and maybe to you, Chris. How will the blockchain inputs be supervised? Tempered automatic data input will be a major problem. So, Chris, how can blockchain inputs be supervised?
I think, I think I had that slide where I was talking about how the oracles, the kind of sources of data for blockchain decisions could be managed, has a lot of the elements there. If you can track the performance of the data sources, that's one thing from the technical point of view of how often the data source is down or if there are problems. That's one issue in terms of working out the efficiency of the blockchain. But I think the thing this is really dealing with is the quality and also the biases that creep in. And I think that this is the same as thinking about the algorithms in those smart contracts and how they are made. There needs to be that openness of access to using the Explorer to see what's actually going on in the chain, and also for customer feedback. The blockchain isn't operating in a void. As I said, I would see it more as a behind the scenes process in terms of that validation of the security. What you need in the application is a way of enhancing that transparency and capturing consumer feedback. So the governance in that sense, certainly when I was looking in relation to agriculture, it has to come from some of that consumer power as well. Many of the blockchain applications that are happening now are driven by that requirement. And yes, there's a huge element of hype, but behind the scenes, there's still some need for validating data in the databases in a stronger way. So my argument would be through the transparency and improving the feedback to crowdsource some of that reaction. With the same problems we have with TripAdvisor and the rest, but still that kind of feedback putting to the crowd would give some control. But I think it would be a little naive to assume that government can play a very strong role here. It would be extremely difficult to police. Some elements, obviously market sources and the rest, are already governed to some extent in that way.
Are there any further thoughts on that from others? If not, Chris, you were talking about not operating in the void. I think that very much or really well relates to another question in that field. So how does the blockchain concept interfere with open markets, especially trade with the global south, like countries in Africa with limited capacities?
I think to be honest, it is an open question, and particularly with the opening up with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, there's been a lot of kind of discussion on this area. I'm afraid I'm not in a position to really give detail on that answer, except to say that it's really causing a headache on all kind of aspects of trade, and having that capacity at country level is a key concern, certainly of the international community. And it goes back to, I think, what was mentioned by Pierre. I mean, this role of the state and government, particularly if you're looking at your agenda being sustainable development goals rather than just absolute profit.
Thank you very much. Maybe that's a question that is interesting for everyone, but maybe also particularly for Christina and for Cynthia and Gianluca. So how should we properly integrate the equity perspective within the agricultural digitalization approach? Whoever wants to go first.
Up to you, and then
Your microphone, Cynthia. Still muted, I'm sorry.
There we go. I think you can approach this from many different angles, okay? And I'll just approach it from a very specific one because it's what my presentation was on. I mean, if we're talking about creating value and we're talking about business, so economic activity in the creation of value, right? I think that we need to really take seriously that we need different business models based on different value creation models. So for example, not all businesses are corporates. Not all businesses create value only for their shareholders. And, you know, our business schools are all focused on that they're corporate shareholders, maximization of profits. And yet most of the world isn't like that. The reason that that's so popular in business schools is because the information's available and you can find annual reports and this kind of stuff in the stock markets. But most businesses are not based on solely that notion of maximization of value for shareholders. It's not just profit centered. So we have to catch up with what's really going on the ground. And that includes in agriculture. You know, I spend a lot of time with farmers, and not just in Almeria, all over the place, from the US to Northern Europe to all over. I've met very few farmers that aren't also very concerned about environmental issues. And they see these things completely integrated. They also see the social issues. They live in their communities. They're affected by the environmental impacts, right? So I think we need to take very seriously the exploration of business models that do integrate other kinds of equitable values, concern for the environment, concern for the community. I'm also the head of the International Cooperative Alliance Europe Research Board. So I spend a lot of time on sort of the cooperative business model. And it's something, you know, that 50% of agricultural businesses, more or less across Europe, are actually cooperative. So it's a model that we already have. And yet we so rarely talk about using that model, leveraging that model to really deliver a different kind of value that integrates all the social, economic, and environmental from way back. I mean, one of the principles is concern for community, and recently more concern for the environment. So that would be my takeaway, is that we really need to seriously promote economic business models that are truly about our community and environment. And it's already done, right? I mean, it's not like we have to build this from scratch.
Yes, if I may, I think that apart from what Cynthia says, and I agree very much that business models are a key to understanding equity, I would say that also the public sector has a very important role. First of all, in regulation of data. So now we consider data as a common, and so the governance of this data should shape data governance in a way that benefits are shared equally. And this is, I think, a key aspect of next regulation, but also the understanding how the technological systems will work. So who owns the data? Who is can use the data? How can be shared? What is the process of facilitation of exchange of data? But the other part is what was discussed yesterday in terms of the capacity, for example, of the platforms or of the technologies to select information to communicate. For example, if we consider responsibility, for the moment, responsibility is decided by the corporate that decide what data can be disclosed and what data cannot be disclosed. But in a framework of sustainability, there should be a set of data that should be disclosed anyway, and there should be homogeneity on the way these data sustainability indicators are disclosed by companies. And the other part is to make this process transparent, so giving access to data and to information about the socioeconomic impact of business. And I think that digital tools on this regard can help a lot, but it is clear that there should be a focus on this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So before we get to a closing round, we're almost a little bit, or we are close to the coffee break. Short last question to you, Tom. One of the audience, or one of the people from the audience, is asking, in which country or countries did the study take place?
The study took place across, I think, 17 different countries, European countries. So it was, it was quite abroad. The bulk of the representation came from, I think, Northwestern Europe. But look at that was maybe because of the distribution of partners in the project. But we have partners in the project from Eastern European countries as well. And we will be following up with our actions in terms of the later stages of the project with further work in those regions.
Thank you very much, Tom. And as a last question, maybe for everyone, but whoever would like to answer or add, please do so. Are there good examples of digitalization affecting behavioral change, for example, on environmental matters? So do you have good examples in mind?
One small one, which was a lovely takeaway from the IOF project, was the decision support system that we developed there. In a very short period of time, we managed to save 30% on water use and provide a really good tracking for nitrates. And that it didn't take any convincing. I mean, when people saw the value in that was something that was easy to sell.
Again, if I could just comment from the FairShare platform, there are a significant number of digital tools which concentrate on efficient nutrient use of fertilizers, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus. And they are at all levels, from telephone apps to very complicated nutrient management planning tools, which are used for administrative and governance control systems and also for agronomic purposes. So we see a huge range of services within that particular platform.
Thank you very much.
Yes, and also from the Desira inventory we made, we found several tools that can support also small farmers to better know their farm and the diversity of their farm, starting from plant varieties pathogens, the crop rotations, etc. I think that this is a very relevant field of inquiry, the capacity of giving farmers supports to better know their system, their agrological system.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, if I may add, many interesting examples of collaborative tools that are developed to understand the dissemination of diseases and pests, and they, of course, there are lots of issues of how you control this, but there are many examples that can help and support changing practices in a sustainable way.
Thank you very much. Chris, any final thoughts? If not, no problem.
I think we're out of time.
Okay.
We had just to stress, I mean, we had a number of examples had the environmental impacts and some change, but because they weren't supported by a business model, they weren't sustainable. So just to always remember that balance. We can solve a lot of things with digital, but we tend to forget how to make it sustainable. And I think that's a key element. Thanks.
These are wonderful final remarks. And here we are at the end of this session and ready for a coffee break. So thank you very much to all of you, our experts. Thank you very much to Pierre for moderating it. And thank you to everyone in the audience that participated in the debate. We will now go straight into a coffee break. And please feel free to participate in our online networking. And you can enter it by clicking the meeting point button in the lower part of your screen. So we will see each other again at 11 a.m. for another track 1 discussion, looking ahead, looking into the future. And now have a great coffee break.